Hey there, welcome to the next episode of the Personal Branding for Professionals video podcast. As a part of the series, we spotlight powerful personal brands across the globe to inspire today's professionals. I'm your host, Ketaki Vaidya, and in today's video, we are going to travel together. We're going to travel to the world of stories. Whenever we listen to a story, we are transported to an entirely different world. We are transported to a different place and time. And who couldn't use that right now? Today's video is about that feeling. Storytelling is not something that you're just born with. It is something that you can develop over time. So what if we can inculcate the art of storytelling and use that to communicate for impact in our daily interactions? Imagine what that could do to our personal brand. Joining us today is Neil Bearden. Neil is a professor at INSEAD in Singapore and runs Slot Wolf, a communications consulting company. He began his career teaching statistics at INSEAD, and since then he has transitioned into storytelling. He has trained many professionals, including senior Google employees and US Navy SEALs, on the art of storytelling and communication. And this particular video, it is really special to me because I had been dreaming about this day for a long time, and to finally see that my dream is coming true, I am so happy about it. I hope you gain as much as you can from this video, because Neil is a great storyteller. So I'm not going to tell you any more stories. I'm directly going to start our conversation so that you can see this for yourself. Hey Neil, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So before we begin, I want to give you a disclaimer that today is not only going to be about us talking on how the art of storytelling can help to build an influential personal brand, but it is also going to be about how well I can stalk someone professionally, because I've seen a lot of your podcasts and videos, and I think that I would know a few of those answers beforehand. So to begin, I'm really curious, first of all, about how you went from teaching statistics, which I know is a story in its own, but how did you go from teaching statistics to teaching storytelling?
I have a number of different stories I tell. One is I had a moment one day when I was teaching statistics. I think it was the central limit theorem, which obviously is incredibly thrilling to most people. And I had to stop. My family's moving some furniture outside. And I had to stop because I was very distracted. The reason why I was distracted is the previous day I had made some financial blunder. I didn't want to talk about the central limit theorem because I was so distracted. And then I just decided to tell my class about the mistake I had made. I told them a story. And my normally reasonably attentive statistics students just were leaning in, and they weren't even blinking when I was telling them a story. When I went away from stats to story, I saw the power of story, because you could hear crickets outside. You could hear a pin drop. No one was blinking. Everyone was paying attention. No one was looking at their phone. They were just listening to the story. And it wasn't even a good story. It was just a story. And I realized at that moment, why am I talking about p-values and all this nonsense? Why don't I try to find a way to get them to do what I was just doing right now, sort of naturally, to tell a story? And so then I got a class in the curriculum called Storytelling Workshop in the MBA. And I knew how to tell stories at that point reasonably well, but I didn't know how to teach other people how to do stories. 7 years later, I've more or less figured that out. And that's what I spend all of my time doing right now, teaching people how to tell stories.
That
because
is
of the
amazing.
blunder.
Yeah, and when we look at stories, I don't think we give it so much thought that there's a science behind it. We feel that any one of us can tell a story, and it's very intriguing how a story can be made interesting, and I'm going to get to that today. But when I look at your journey, I see that you started with a lot of geeky stuff, right? And then you went on to teaching statistics, then you went on to teaching storytelling. Along the way, you became a poet, and you also invested in a few companies, and then you found out that the life of those founders was cooler than yours, and then at 47 you gave up and a career in academia to start a company of your own. So I want to understand that throughout this journey, did you have these moments where you felt low or where you felt that you did not know what you were doing, and how did you tackle those if you faced that?
Yeah, I almost never feel like I know what I'm doing. I always feel like an imposter who's just sort of trying to find his way along. So there was no single moment that was like that. Pretty much the whole way felt that way. And I decided to make a transition from academia to becoming an entrepreneur simply by asking myself a question: what will I regret? And it was incredibly clear to me that if I just kept doing the reasonably well paying, incredibly safe job for the next 20 years, that at the end of the road, I would feel like an absolute 100% loser. And so then that decided it for me, just by looking ahead.
Right. And I don't think a lot of us do that. We are in our own bubble. We think that we're doing good, but it's if it's to show to people that it's okay to take risks and it's okay to have experiments before you can reach the why of your personal brand. I think that's your story. And when you look back at your journey, do you also, I want to understand, when did your love for stories begin? Did you always have a predilection towards it, or was it an incident or a person that triggered this?
I'm old, right? You said it, I'm 47. So I remember a time where I would go to places, I would go hunting, I would be in the woods with a bunch of grown men. There was no television. We were so far out, there was no radio, there was no phone, no satellites beaming stuff in. And guys would just sit around the proverbial campfire, drink beer and tell stories. And I grew up around that. That was absolutely normal to me. So it's been there the whole time. What came later, what I didn't know, was that actually you could teach other people how to do that. For me, it was just a very, very normal activity.
Right.
I became progressively interested in it when I saw the power of it. And maybe what you're nudging me towards, I don't know, is, and I tell this story so often, I hope no one hears me do different things because I'll think I have nothing else to say but talk about this one. But one of the absolute pivotal moments for me was meeting a homeless man in San Francisco named Osiris.
Yeah.
The short version of it is, I was walking around, I met a homeless poet. I ended up spending the next 7 hours in a bar with this homeless poet who just the whole time read poetry to me. And he was a homeless poet in San Francisco, and I was a postdoc in neuroscience at Duke University, which felt to me like I was on the path to making it. But then I met this guy who went around all day doing poetry, and I felt, even though he was homeless, he was somehow living a richer life than I was living around my tweed jacket, boring academic colleagues. So after I flew back home from San Francisco to North Carolina, where I was living, I started writing poetry. I started writing incredibly bad poetry with the ambition that maybe some points I will be able to have the courage to do what this man does every day, perform poetry. So then I started performing poetry. At first it was terrible. Then it got a little bit better. And what happened progressively over time is I started getting more and more in front of microphones, more and more on stage. When I would get on stage, when I had a microphone in front of me, I would tell a story. Often I would tell a story, excuse me, about Osiris, the guy who got me doing poetry. And again, it was like the stats students with the central limit theorem. When I would go from my kind of bad poetry to telling a story about why I was doing poetry, I saw the impact of storytelling because they were just leaning in at a 45-degree angle, not blinking. You could hear crickets outside. And I kept having these moments where the world just went quiet, and the world would go quiet generally when I was telling a story. And that just progressively incentivized me to do it more and more, because that's when you know it's working well.
Yeah.
People lean in and they don't blink, and you can hear crickets.
I think that's the beauty of story, right? You get your feedback right away. If people are not interested, you know that you're telling a bad story and you need to do better next time. And when people are all in, that's when you know that you're maybe getting them interested with your story. And with this homeless poet that you told me about, I think this guy had nothing to lose, and that sort of took away the fear of doing something that he was not made of, right? And we all often we think that we have a lot to lose, and that's the reason that we are not ready to take risks, and that's the reason that we are never even on the path to finding ourselves, and that itself is a journey on its own.
So something that is relevant to your content, I the longer version of that story is I spent 7 hours with this dude. At the end of it, he very carefully tore out this piece of paper from one of his 20 notebooks that he had in his bag. These notebooks filled with poetry. He handed it to me. Somehow on the way home, I lost the one piece of evidence that I had of my experience with this guy, the one piece of paper, which I never even got to read. I just put it in my pocket when he gave it to me. I got back to my hotel, realized that I lost it, went back to the boring neuroscience conference the next day. The following evening, so the evening after I met Osiris, I was having dinner with colleagues. One of my colleagues asked me, "What did you do last night?"
Mhm.
I told him about Osiris, 7 hours, poet, the piece of paper he gave me, the one that I lost. And I was quite emotional because I spent 7 intense hours with this dude.
Yeah.
And I lost the one bit of documentary evidence that I had of it. And my colleague in his tweed jacket, my Ivy League educated colleague, asked me a question that, maybe even changed my life more than storytelling. He asked me, "Why weren't you networking last night?" So he was asking me, "Why weren't you at the conference sucking up to people, wearing a little name tag, walking around, trying to somehow improve your career prospects in some way? Why were you out hanging out with some homeless dude?" And that helped me a lot because his identity or his objective or his preferences or the way he approached life
Hmm.
was so tied up with his professional identity
Yeah.
that he was boring.
Hmm.
And I knew when he said that, actually, he had a bigger impact on me than Osiris did, because I thought, I never want to become this guy. I'd much rather hang out with Osiris than this dude. I don't want to be homeless like Osiris, of course. I'm not going to overclaim, but I don't want to be boring like this dude. I don't remember that guy's name. I don't remember anything about that dude because he was just boring. He didn't have any personal brand. He didn't have anything, as far as I could tell, except some objective of improving his career. Whereas Osiris was this horribly overabused word, authentic in some way.
Hmm.
And now, 15 years later, I'm talking about this authentic, real human being who wasn't holding back from me, who was straight with me,
Yeah.
who was present with me. And the so-called professional, boring guy who would never say anything, reveal anything about himself, just indistinct like everyone else, I don't remember him. And probably most people at that conference don't remember that guy.
Yeah. And
But
I
there's
think
there's very little risk in just being yourself. There's value in it.
and at this point, I think you were able to visualize the two paths that your life could turn into. One was where you were truly being authentic, and one was where you were networking with people at conferences, trying to give them your elevator pitch and trying to show them that you were worthy of something.
Yep, I ain't doing that.
I'm glad. I'm glad. Otherwise, we couldn't have had such a great storyteller to this world. So, tell me one thing that where I did watch a video of yours, the bicycle guy, and it was what showed me the power of stories. So, what makes a powerful story? What are the characteristics that we should look at when we are articulating our own story?
When I met Osiris, I was standing. This is 2005. There was no Google Map. I was standing on a street corner around Union Square, holding a paper map. I get a tap on my shoulder. I turn around. There's this old black guy, pretty short, this long gray beard, and he's standing there in this overcoat. It's August. He's standing in this overcoat that's about 4 sizes too big, with this big scarf wrapped around his neck.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, "Would you like to hear some poetry, young man?" I'm holding my map. I didn't know what to say. I thought I was getting hustled. Uh, okay. And he said, there are latent semantics embedded deep down inside these rambles. These aren't the ravings of a madman alone in the dark with candles. These are my notes from the underground. And he gave me some poetry. Now, you asked me a question, what makes a story, or what makes a story good? And very simple.
Mm-hmm.
If you treat your objective when you're telling a story of quite literally trying to get your audience to see what you're saying, then you're on the right path. Okay, so that digression about Osiris on the street corner, that was a digression, but it was one with intent. Because what did I want you to see? Me on the street corner, holding a map in Union Square, get a tap on my shoulder, turn around, old black guy, short, with a big gray beard, coat 4 sizes too big, wearing a big scarf, doing some poetry. And if you got any mental images when I said that, then I was successful.
Yeah.
So storytelling, it doesn't need to be some big journey heroes. You don't need Yoda in it. Most people, when they communicate, if they want to communicate like storytellers, the main intent should be to try to make what you're saying visual to your audience.
Right.
Again, without abusing the English language, to quite literally get them to see what you're saying. That's the main thing. And if they happen when you're telling a story to experience some emotion, and at the end of it, if they see that some change has occurred in the protagonist, quite often that's the storyteller herself, but if they see that some change has taken place through this little mental movie that you gave them, and there's some point to it that they can somehow use in their own lives, if only to appreciate their life or not to make some mistake that you made, if they get some point out of this little movie that you give them at the end, then probably it was a pretty good story. Conversely, what is a bad story? A bad story, often a bad story isn't even a story. People say they have a story, but then they just end up giving a crappy little speech. Okay, I have an acronym that I use a lot when I work with people, SLS, called the crappy little speech. And that is when people speak and they just talk, but they don't give their audience a mental movie. They just give them sort of a list. I was passionate. I went there. I really want to change the world. And they give some little bad speech, but it's not a story. Whereas a story is visual. Something happens to someone and there's some change that occurs. So what's a bad story? One that's a speech, nothing happens, your audience doesn't see anything, and there's no clear point for the audience, because you must suppose that your audience is selfish. In fact, anytime you communicate, you should suppose that your audience is selfish. They're thinking, so what? What's in it for me?
Yeah.
And if it's some story that just, or some speech, whatever, in the worst case, that just matters to you, but there's nothing important in it for the audience, there's no fundamental truth of the universe that's expressed by the story, to use hyperbole, then they're not going to listen. Okay, so bad is a speech with no point for the audience. That's completely avisual. Right. Good is visual, character, change, something happens that gives a point that's relevant somehow to the audience. Okay, so those are the two ends of the spectrum.
Got it. You summarized it beautifully, but I do have one question here, that if a person is an introvert, how do they approach storytelling? Because I think that as an introvert, people might not even be able to open up to others, let alone articulating their own story. So how do you suggest that introverts approach this art?
Yep. If you're an introvert, or even if you're not an introvert, but especially if you're an introvert, quite possibly you overestimate the risk of telling a story, that you're more intimidated by it than you should be. So it causes you to be more introverted.
Right.
What's the best way to overcome that? Prepare. So if you develop a story, if you write it out and then you practice it, and what's the best way to practice it? The best way to practice it is to record it. Write out a story, listen to yourself say it. You can read out your script, or you can just use the script as notes and listen to it and get it dialed in so that you have a reasonable sense that it's actually effective. Then what should happen? Well, a critical variable should also improve if you do that. You should become more confident.
Yeah.
Because if you know you have content that you've worked on that is likely to work if you deliver it, and then you become more confident in your ability to tell the story, then that confidence can compensate a bit for the introversion. But if you're an introvert, let's again do the converse test. If you're an introvert and you don't write it out and you don't practice, and you know that if you just start freestyling, it's probably going to be terrible.
Yeah.
Well, that whatever the opposite of confidence is, that is probably going to increase your introversion, introverted characteristics, and you'll just be quiet. So, very long-winded way of saying the best way to overcome it is to prepare, and don't focus on becoming a good storyteller as much as focus on preparation as a means to improving confidence, which will then enable you to tell more stories, which will allow you to practice more with other people. And when it works, you should become more confident, which will make you practice more. And over time, you'll put in the reps, you'll put in your 10,000 hours equivalent, and you'll get better at it. What's the worst thing you can do? Nothing. That's the worst thing you can do. Oh, I'm shy. I'm just an introvert. I don't have anything to say. That's resistance talking to you, right? It's easy to give yourself a bunch of excuses. Oh, I can't do it for this and that. And then you end up 80 years old, miserable. I'm sorry I spent my life this way, and you blew it. Alternatively, you can just start writing it down, recording it, practicing it, trying it on other people. And again, if you practice on your friend, practice on boyfriend, mom, someone, a couple people when you're having lunch, and then just keep putting in those reps, and you'll find that, like anything, the more you do it, the easier it gets. So you just must do it. That's what introverts must do, and everyone else.
Right. And I read in your LinkedIn post the other day that you can practice with Alexa too, right? Because that's a very good way. I usually bore my family members to death with all my stories and all my speeches, and sometimes they get to a point where they cannot bear it beyond that. So I think Alexa would be that loyal partner that I can rely on in this case.
It's actually a wonderful tool for doing it.
Yeah.
So what I really like it for is you can hear what your story sounds like. It's hard when you're listening to yourself to really hear it, but if you write it out and you just use any text to speech to play it back to you, if it's good, quite likely you'll sense that it's good. If it's full of a bunch of fluff that's boring you as the computer reads it back to you, then probably that's the stuff you should get rid of. So there are many ways you can practice. That's one for sure.
Yeah, and I think putting yourself in audience's shoes, that's very important, because then you do understand what the crux of it is, and whether you really have a story, or is it just that bad speech that we talked about.
The crappy little speech. Yep.
The crappy little speech. Yes. So now that we're talking about communicating for impact, a lot of times we say something, but the people interpret it differently. And it's not anyone's fault, because they interpret it based within the radius of their assumptions and their experiences. And it leads to a very awkward situation. So I'm sure that even when people articulate their own story, there can be instances where they say something, or they're trying to be funny, but it is taken as offensive, or it is taken in a different way. So how should we inculcate the sense of clarity in those stories?
Well, there is something you can do, which is just plan and be intentional, going back to what I was saying before. In real time, if you're just winging it and someone misunderstands, I don't know what's to say to fix that. Don't wing it, or shut up if you don't have anything to say. I don't think that's very useful.
Yeah.
But in other cases, what you want to do is really, if you tell a story, it's best to be kind of a control freak. To think, I'm going to tell this story, and what I'm trying to control is that sort of radius of interpretations. Let me just make that as small as possible by being clear, adding redundancy, clarifying, and just getting very clear on what your objective is, and then engineer your story and practice it with text to speech, Alexa, whatever, so that when you do go deliver it in real time, you minimize the noise and the error in it that leads to that. In real time, I don't know when you can plan.
Right. If it's an impromptu story, that also can have its own versions where you practice, right? Where you practice that if there's an impromptu situation, you would come up with the story, right? If we have to practice.
In an impromptu situation, the best thing you can do is you must always attend to your audience. Okay, so don't just start talking, go inside yourself like you're the only person who exists. attend to them obsessively. Notice when they blink, you just blinked, you just looked up to the left, you were just thinking about something. Notice when they look off. Notice if when you're talking to them, if when someone walks by, they avert their gaze to look at some stranger walking by. Any of these are indications that they're not fully listening to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Or if they grimace, or if you say something and you can see that their lips are pursed and they're waiting to speak. If you notice all of these
Hmm.
not so subtle signals that they're giving you, then you have opportunity to recourse. Conversely, if you're not paying attention to them, you're just talking to them like they're a tree, or just like you're thinking out loud, you're all by yourself, you're not going to notice that stuff, that they misunderstood you, that you offended them, that they're
Hmm.
confused, that they have something to add. If you don't do that, then it's not going to work. So just respond to the feedback. But first, witness the feedback. It's right there, it's screaming at you.
Yeah, that is true. And I don't think a lot of us observe that because we are there to give our crappy little speech, and we want to reach that destination where we've given their entire speech. We have this content that we really want to deliver, and we don't observe what the audience is feeling like, whether we are really adding any value or whether we are simply here to talk about our accomplishments or something.
And people can't hide it.
Yeah.
I mean, we think that we can hide it, that when we're bored on a Zoom call, we're just there, our videos turned on. We think that we're just being a good audience member. If you're bored, almost surely to a reasonably astute observer, it's incredibly clear that you're bored, that you're distracted, that you don't like it.
Hmm.
Okay, so if you recognize that that's true for you, and it is, well, for you as a storyteller, as a speaker, that gives you something to work with. Okay,
Yeah.
so you just know that it's just entirely right there in front of you.
Right.
It's
And
not hidden.
yeah, definitely. I think this is a great tip, and I never thought of speech or stories in that way. I'm going to give more attention next time. And another thing that I feel is important is when we are starting to build our personal brand, there are these instances where you're just getting started. So you have to talk about your accomplishments, or you have to show people that you know what you're doing. So how would you suggest that people project their accomplishments through storytelling?
First, just get really clear, specify your objective. And your objective is not to talk about your accomplishments. You're talking about your accomplishments for some other purpose, for some other objective.
Yeah.
Get clarity on that, and then figure out, okay, what can I say that is most relevant with achieving that objective?
Mhm.
And somewhere there's going to be a mediating factor that's going to determine whether or not you're successful. The most critical one is going to be, do they actually even remember what you say? Because you can have a personal brand, no personal brand. You can call yourself ketchup, mustard, peanut butter, pickle. You can characterize yourself any way. But if when you describe yourself, it's not distinct in some critical way from all the other people who describe themselves, then you're not going to be remembered. So
Mm.
I don't think people shouldn't be so worried about personal branding as being distinct, right?
Yeah.
It's useful to find the right word. And if you're not distinct, you're going to be forgotten. And if you're forgotten, you had no impact. You're left behind.
Yeah.
So when you communicate, realize, okay, if Neil was right, let's at least entertain the possibility he was right. Then when I communicate, I should be trying to make myself distinct and or so that people remember me.
Hmm.
And my tip at this point is you should use the old dating trick, right? Probably you've heard me say this before. I'll tell it to your folks. It's an old trick from the 1980s. When you go on a date,
Hmm.
always bring along some sunglasses.
Yeah.
And you go to someone's house, she cooks for you, he cooks for you.
Hmm.
When everyone's leaving, you think, I wouldn't mind a second date with this person. And what you do is you sneak over to the sofa, you put your sunglasses under one of the pillows, and then you'll get a call next day. Hey, someone left some sunglasses at my house last night. Are these yours? Oh, yes, they were mine. Can I meet you at Starbucks today at 4 o'clock? I'm going to be near your house. Okay, I'll see you at Starbucks at 4. And because you deliberately left something behind, you got that call, you got a second date.
Yeah.
Now, when you're introducing yourself, if you're just going through your CV And probably, I mean, I hate to break it to most people, even if you think your CV is fancy, it still sounds like a whole bunch of CVs. So if that's what you go through, if if you worked at Goldman Sachs and then you went to NYU Stern for your MBA, whatever you did, there are a whole bunch of people like that, thousands of people like that.
Yeah.
But if you realize, okay, there are thousands of people like that, but there is something distinct about me, what can I leave in here so that people will remember that one thing, my sunglasses? And when they remember my sunglasses, my critically distinct thing that makes them remember me, they'll remember that I worked at Goldman Sachs and went to NYU Stern, all the other stuff. So there must be some deliberate characteristic in there.
Yeah. And I think I watched another of your video where you said that you're not just a can of beans. That's where this is getting at, that you have to make yourself memorable. At the end of the day, everyone has had the experiences that you've had in your CV. Everyone has that. But what is it that makes you different, and how can you stand out? It's by being memorable.
Yep.
So
And being memorable in some relevant way.
yeah,
Right.
definitely.
So not just, don't just show up wearing a chicken suit or something like that, because that will definitely make you memorable. But if you think, what is the point I would like to make, and in what way am I distinct? So for me, I met Osiris. I started doing poetry,
Mm.
and then I got fourth place in the Singapore Grand Slam of Poetry one year. Now, that's the kind of thing, getting fourth place in some poetry competition you never heard of. That's not what most people brag about. But often when I talk about my backgrounds, I will mention, right? It's perfectly okay. You don't
Mm.
sound like a jerk if you say you got fourth place in something, like you're bragging.
Yeah.
And I tell it to people, and then people remember,
Yeah.
right? Because if I had said I got first place, maybe they'll remember it. But there's just something weird and unusual about someone telling you, I got fourth place in the Singapore Grand Slam of Poetry. That's worked for me, for instance. And I can make that professionally relevant in conversations.
Yeah. And I think when people have conversations, especially in an interview, they're always worried about the fact that mentioning this would be digressing from what is expected out of their role, or it would not be relevant. But it's about how you can twist that particular aspect in a way that it is relevant to what you're bringing to the table.
Yep, that's one part. Another, uh, people misunderstand risk quite systematically. So people think, if I talk about something that's off script, that's a bit risky because I'm supposed to stay on script.
Yeah.
If I don't, people will think it's weird. But then what's the problem? Well, that leads to kind of a funny equilibrium where everyone who comes in and interviews and talks sticks to the script. They kind of all sound the same. So then 2 weeks later, when the committee's meeting to discuss who they want to hire, well, everyone gave those plain, boring, stuck to the script, professional answers, no departure from it. Who stands out? Well, maybe you, or maybe someone else, or maybe no one.
Yeah.
Whereas if you gave the critical stuff when you're answering, the stuff that they want to hear, and you made it interesting by being distinct, which generally means going off script in some way,
Yeah.
then when later on when they huddle, oh yeah, she's the one who makes her own pickles. Yeah, I remember her. I liked her. Even though that has nothing to do with the job role, if somehow you manage to work in that you make your own pickles, when you're talking about creativity and problem solving
Yeah.
and design, and you somehow, at least in some marginal way, made it relevant, people are going to remember that, because no one else had, when they were interviewing, was talking about making her own pickles. And now you left some sunglasses. She remembered you. She remembers all the reasons why she liked you.
Yeah.
Because you left those sunglasses. So the risky thing is just to summarize, the risky thing is not taking any so-called risk, because then you just sound like everyone else.
Yeah.
Boring, generally.
Yeah. And there are these templates that the society has defined for us that we have to stick to. So those templates govern whatever we do, and we only behave that certain way because that is what is expected out of us. And as you said, it'll be worth in the end to go off script, and if you can make it relevant, I think it'll still be okay.
And by the way, so people, whoever listens to this, they won't remember anything from this, except if I run into someone in the Mumbai airport Oh, I heard you. And you know what they'll remember? I'll tell you the one thing they'll remember she makes her own pickles.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing, right? Because it was, where'd that come from? No one was expecting that. And then we got that. And that will be the sunglasses in this whole conversation you and I had. And that's good enough. If they
Hmm.
say, "Oh, I remember you talking about that," then that's a segue into a conversation.
Right.
That one thing, right? Because it wasn't what people were expecting. It stands out. It will be the sunglasses if I had to bet.
Nice. And I think this is where your PhD in psychology really helps, right? Because you can play with the human brain, you can understand what is going to leave an impact. Does that help in your storytelling?
It does, but it's all Psych 101 stuff. It's not particularly sophisticated. So if I read out a list of words to you: bed, rest, awake, tired, hippopotamus, dream, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn,
Mm.
drowsy. If I do that and then I have everyone who heard that write down all the words they remember,
Mm.
everyone, so a lot of people will forget doze, a lot of people will forget slumber, everyone will write down hippopotamus, right? That's called the von Restorff effect. And it's just distinct things are more easily remembered. So once you just understand, and this is basic Psych 101 stuff, that
Yeah.
the sunglasses idea, being deliberate, pickles, all of that, it's just somehow leveraging in a pretty obvious way that distinctiveness effect in memory. So you can use those little things. It's not sophisticated, it's pretty simple. They just do it with intent is the key
Yeah.
thing.
Do it with intent and practice, definitely, because you cannot try this stuff for the first time with someone, right? That.
Or you can, and again, the bits together we've been talking about for the last 3 minutes, you can do it. If you think that you shouldn't do it, probably you're just overestimating the risk of doing it. Because if it doesn't work out, if it seems goofy or irrelevant, so what? What's going to happen?
Hmm.
Nothing. So what do a lot of people do? They think, oh, well, I'll wait, I'll practice, I'll order a psychology textbook. And in the meantime, they're not practicing, they're not doing anything, they're just procrastinating.
Yeah.
So just do it. It's simple.
Absolutely. So this brings me to the last segment of this episode, and that's what would be that one advice that you give people if they are just getting started and they're on the path to finding themselves.
The two things. One is, if you have something that you would like to communicate, a
Hmm.
story or whatever it is, plan it out a little bit, but definitely don't try to make it perfect.
Hmm.
Oh, I'll wait. I need to read a little bit more Aristotle to learn about the three-act structure. And people can do all kind of things.
Yeah.
And the most important thing you can do, another acronym, is just to put down what's called an SFD. In writing, an SFD is what's called a crappy first draft. So if you have a story that you would like to work on in your job interviews or some professional setting, just sketch it out a little bit. Don't try to make it perfect. And
Hmm.
then just practice. Just deliver that first draft. See if people lean in and don't blink.
Hmm.
Or maybe when you start telling it to people, maybe everyone's twitching and writing messages on WhatsApp and not listening to you.
Yeah.
But just MVP test it. Treat your story like a startup,
Hmm.
right? Just build, measure, learn. Get that MVP, test it, try it, tweak it. Don't sit there planning, oh, one day, someday, maybe I'll take a course, oh, I'll go watch some YouTube video. All that is procrastination.
Hmm.
Procrastination, that's just resistance.
Yeah.
The best thing to do is to start now. Then, when you do start, besides leaving sunglasses, these are just little tactics.
Hmm.
But the best thing you can do is just, again, these horrible words, just to be authentic when you tell your story.
Yeah.
Don't try to act, don't try to play yourself up, don't try to BS. Just be vulnerable and be authentic and be
Hmm.
truthful, in short. And if you're truthful when you tell stories, people appreciate that. It's much more likely to work. If you construe it as some performance, some acting, it needs to be perfect, I can't be vulnerable, I need to be professional, all this garbage, then it's going to sound like some sales pitch when you
Hmm.
do it. And it's probably going to be bad and it's going to fall flat. Just take what you perceive to be risk, but it's not really a risk because you're overestimating that. Just try it with your SFD. Do it, be honest, vulnerable, truthful. You will almost certainly get feedback that it worked well relative to your normal crappy little speech way of communicating. You'll get that positive feedback. It'll incentivize you to try it some more. When you do try it some more, you'll get another rep in, more practice, you'll improve, which will then further increase your confidence, and you'll get into this virtuous loop. Or you can just do nothing. Keep waiting on, order another book off Amazon. Oh, I think I'll go watch a TED talk on this. And that's just resistance. That's just wasting time, wasting your life. So best advice is just do it now.
Yeah. That's a great advice. Thank you so much, Neil, for your time today. I think the best part of having a video podcast, I tell everyone, is that I get to have some great conversations. But today's conversation was a conversation where I got to sit back and listen to a lot of beautiful stories and analogies. And I did have some interesting stories that are exclusive to this video. So thank you so much for sharing all of it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Hello again, if you are back to the reality from the story world, and if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. Tell me what you learned from this video and what is your story. I'm looking forward to listening to your stories. See you next Monday. Bye.